this chat is basically an attempt which is being made by a group called Grassroots India, which is effectively trying to raise awareness and bring issues related to disability laws in India. And brief introduction about all of us. There is Nipun here with us. Uh,
Hi.
Moderator for news channel CNN-IBN. And then I forgot the other person's name. Apoorva.
Hi, yeah, I'm Apoorva Shankar
Yeah.
from PRS Legislative Research.
Yeah, your video suddenly froze, so that's why I was just getting a little worried. Anyway, so there's Apoorva, there's Amba, there's Nipun, and there is me. The idea, guys, is to just figure out what are the laws in India related to disability, disabled people, differently abled people. On our television channel, I myself have done a lot of programs where we've often tried to raise issues related to the kind of approach that the government has adopted in in recent times. There have been many instances where people with disabilities, for instance, have been deboarded from airplanes. Government agencies have often been accused of being lazy, not being sensitive when it comes to the question of looking after the needs of individuals. There is a parliamentary standing committee as well, which has been responsible for framing the new amendments which are being now included in the Disability Act of 1995, which has been in place since 1995. So, what let's just hear from all of you and see what is it that you believe should be done by the government. Nipun, maybe we'll start with you. Why don't you tell us what do you believe? What do you believe is that one key step you believe that the government must take if this message has to come across from this establishment that really is thinking in terms of looking after the needs of those who are disabled or those who are differently able?
So my disability is a locomotor disability. I mean, I'm restricted to a wheelchair. And one of the biggest challenges I face is that whenever I have to go anywhere, the trip has to be pre-planned because not all physical infrastructure is really accessible in India. I mean, just to give you an example, till class 10th, I used to read books of my mom's choice because I'd never entered a bookshop because bookshops were not really accessible. Till today, I cannot use an ATM because ATM machines are too high and I cannot really reach an ATM. I am an entrepreneur myself, and I missed a very important meeting at Hayat 3 weeks back because there were 2 stories of steps to the coffee shop at Hayat, and I couldn't reach there in Delhi itself. So right from a simple ATM machine that everybody has to go to a bookshop, which I think is almost like a right to everybody, to even a big physical infrastructure, including if a 5 star is not accessible, you really can't expect anything else in India to be accessible. So I think uh, accessibility of infrastructure is the biggest problem I personally face as a person with a disability in India.
Yeah. The point that you're making, Nipun, is a point which I think this point has been raised, I think now for almost, 15, 20 years. And even now I see that, for instance, I stay in Noida, and I see that there is a whole new approach to architecture, to construction of buildings, and which are all going to be all energy guzzling buildings. But I see that even now, I think as a very first step, which I think government agencies should definitely consider in terms of thinking, is that when they approve the building layout, the map for any building, the, the map itself should have provisions which are inbuilt to look after the kind of queries that you are raising. So, for instance, say it's construction of a simple ramp. Now, Amba, what is it true that as far as the law is concerned, I'm surprised that this so far hasn't been included in the
Yes.
draft legislation. Then why should it not be there that any building, just like you have to get a map approved by the relevant authorities, shouldn't that map also have these provisions?
So this is actually the under the 1995 Act, which under the 1995 Act, there's also been provisions on accessibility of infrastructure, and the limitations there was that it is typically, it's been limited to what are government establishment buildings. And this is something which actually one of the greatest drawbacks of the 2014 bill, which is presently being uh, discussed before which is presently before the Parliamentary Standing Committee, is that even then the definition of establishment is clearly government buildings. And people with disabilities, of course, you will need to go to court and you will need to go to the collector's office. But more importantly, you should be able to go to, say, a shopping mall or a movie theater or, like an office building. And that's something which hasn't been seen in this new legislation. In earlier drafts of the bill, I will refer back to 2011, which is the first civil society draft which came out. And in that, there was a clear definition of what is a public building. And the definition of public building really was to include any building where public have access or where there what I'm trying to say is that the definition is much broader. And in this legislation, which is 2014, and which is supposed to be implementing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which clearly talks about access to all public facilities, right, regardless of whether it's government or private sector. In such a situation, it seems, it seems short or these requirements, as you said, to say that a plan needs to be approved, it needs to have accessibility provisions, that this is only limited to government establishments. So that's problematic. So yeah.
Is also joins. Hi, welcome to the chat. What are your thoughts?
I'm sorry, there's some disturbance in the.
Raise this point about where
I'm sorry, I seem to have been. Am I the only person who can't hear Bhupendra?
No, I couldn't catch that either.
Okay. Yeah, I can see you and Nipun.
Right, I think it's frozen.
Okay, so I believe maybe Mr. Bhupendra Chaubey's net connection has gone. While I send him an invite again, Apoorva, can I please ask you probably to step in here and highlight the points that you feel are, as key issues that PRS has raised with the bill, and also probably some of the suggestions that you have made to the Standing Committee on Social Justice and Empowerment for the 2014 bill?
Right, Deepa, thanks. So there are a few things that the new bill, the 2014 bill that is currently pending in the Rajya Sabha is doing. Essentially, it is changing the definition of a person with disability. What the current act, what the current Persons with Disability Act of 95 defined a person with disability as was somebody who had a 40% of a specified disability. And they had only 7 specified disability, and amongst that, if you had 40% and above of a disability, you were recognized as a person with disability. But what the current bill is aiming to do is change that, and even whether you have 1% to whether you have a 99% or 100% of a disability, you are recognized as a person with disability. So that's a major change. Within that, it's creating a new category of persons called persons with benchmark disabilities. So amongst the new list of specified 19 disabilities, if you have 40% and above of a disability, you are a person with benchmark disability. So that means that you're entitled to certain extra facilities and benefits under the bill. So that's one major change. What certain things that that could be highlighted as issues within the bill was something to do with resources. So the central government has come up with this bill, and it's given a lot of mandates, such as creating ramps and making all public documents accessible, all sorts of infrastructural support, even including healthcare and healthcare services and education to persons with disability between 6 to 18 years of age. So a lot of things, but interestingly, there's no financial memorandum in the bill. So it doesn't seem like the expenditure that would be required has been estimated for all these things that the bill is promising to do. So that's
So
one
what
interesting thing.
are you saying, Apoorva, that the problem is that the government may well have, let's say, identified the issues, but they haven't really figured out how much money is needed to be spent? Is that what the issue is?
Yes, so that's one thing. Whereas it would have been useful to say that, because right now it's unclear whether the states are supposed to be bringing in this money, because this is a central bill, but the mandate on providing on all of these things, whether it's education or health or whatever, could fall under the mandate of state governments or municipalities. But it has not been clarified where the money will be coming from. Are they supposed to shell it out, or will there be a central state sharing the issue? So there is no idea of the kind of money that will be brought in to fulfill the objectives of the bill.
Amba, let's look at what goes on in other countries. Say, for instance, you're there in London. I understand that these are still sort of this is a
So a bit on what happens in other countries is that accessibility provisions. Well, one is when we look at accessibility of infrastructure, it's not just while ramps and lifts are extremely important. There are also other aspects of accessibility which sometimes do not get addressed. One of them would be, for example, the use. How do you communicate with people with who face disabilities while communicating? For example, the deaf and hard of hearing, or say persons, the visually impaired and blind. And there are aspects of accessibility which require to be seen there as well. I believe that in Europe, a lot of the changes came across with the European Convention on Human Rights, and you also have many rulings of the European Commission with regard to various accessibility standards. I think Grassroots has already recently tweeted about the Americans with Disabilities Act, and about what obligations that has placed on infrastructure in the United States. So I think, in terms of, which is why I think the point which is raised by Apoorva is important, is because it's very easy to say that things need to be made accessible, but unless we're not really sure about what that means, and we're not really sure about, because, for example, like accessibility itself is not defined under the Act. So when we say, is it just physical infrastructure? Is it other means of assistance? And so, therefore, when it's being budgeted, what exactly is being taken into consideration? It becomes a huge issue, because it's the UNCRPD does not. And the reason why I stress on the UNCRPD is because this bill, in its opening statement, is supposed to be implementing the UNCRPD and India's commitments to its citizens under the UNCRPD. So therefore, we need to test it against the UNCRPD, which doesn't, again, as Apoorva said, does not define or discriminate between disabilities. Accessibility for all disabilities is what the cornerstone is. So in such a situation, it becomes important to see how much is this really going to costs, and there's not only is it physical infrastructure, you also need to develop manpower for this, for implementing the bill, which is something that it really needs to be considered as to how this is going to happen.
But would we have? I'm just wondering, Amba, that because Nipun was talking about the money. Apoorva was talking about how the government hasn't really put a finger on how much money is required. So let's say,
Sure.
do we have any budgetary estimate of how much money would be spent in terms of dealing with all these issues, say in Europe?
I don't have the figures with me right now. I can try and pull it up to see um, what it is. But I remember from what I've read is that budgetary allocation for the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, which is currently, that is the disability is split actually between two ministries, I would say, because mental illness rather is also a disability. That kind of sometimes does not get considered, which gets under the Ministry of Health, and disabilities are under the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. I think Apoorva might be in a better position to explain how exactly this. Yeah.
Yeah, Apoorva, I mean that's an interesting thought, which is coming there from Amba. So let's say there is the health ministry, then there is the Ministry for Social Justice. Now I've often seen, and I'm just making a completely political comment here, that I'm yet to see any government, even when the UPA was in power. Ghulam Nabi Azad was the health minister for the longest time. Harshvardhan was the health minister, and he's just been replaced now. I sometimes get the sense that the kind of priority, let's say, the best person for any government is always, let's say, in finance ministry or say in the home ministry. Do you get a sense that maybe the lawmakers actually don't look at health as a priority area?
So it's difficult for me to comment on that, but it is true that disability is right now sort of split up in the way it is dealt with ministry-wise. Right now, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment is the one that has come up with the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Bill, because I guess the thought was that it's addressing the rights and entitlements of the disabled more, and it's coming from the UN Convention that we ratified in 2007. But on the other hand, there is the Mental Health Care Act of 1987, which is still in place. It is dealing with the mentally ill, and it is dealing with a lot of important, like the guardianship provisions, which are available for the mentally ill. One place wherein within the Rights of Persons with Disability Bill, the mentally ill are being recognized, apart from obviously being recognized as a category of disability. There is a provision on guardianship, which basically talks about that on a default basis, if a mentally ill person has a guardian, it is limited guardianship, which basically means that if I'm a limited guardian looking after a mentally ill person, then I will make all legal decisions in a joint manner with both with that person. But the bill is introducing a guardianship called plenary guardianship, which is basically that a district court, on finding of if they find it difficult to provide a limited guardian to a mentally ill person incapable of taking care of themselves, they may in extraordinary situations assign a plenary guardian. Now there could be an issue here because an extraordinary situation is not defined in the bill, and neither are there any guidelines provided by the bill for what would qualify as an extraordinary situation. So, I mean, there are some 600 odd district courts in the country. Each district court could interpret an extraordinary situation differently, and for a similar case, it's possible that a plenary guardian could be assigned somewhere, whereas he couldn't be assigned somewhere else. So this is one thing where the mentally ill come into play in the rights of persons with disability, and the guardianship issue could be something that can be debated. And it's also different in the sense that Mental Health Care Act provides some safeguards for the mentally ill, which this bill doesn't really envision, because when you're dealing with the property of a mentally ill person within the Mental Health Care Act, there are some safeguards in the sense that you have to constantly report to the district court as to how you're dealing with the property. You can't sell it for more than 5 years. You can't lease it off for more than 5 years, etc. Which this bill doesn't envision. And one extremely important thing is that it doesn't recognize that a mental illness could be prevalent for a short period of time temporarily. So if I am, if I get out of my mental illness and I have a plenary guardian, there is no scope, there's no provision for removal of that plenary guardianship. So these are a few things that could be issues with respect to mental illness and guardianship in the bill.
If I could also just come in there on the subject of guardianship, because guardianship provisions also exist in India with regard to persons with the 4 disabilities covered under the National Trust Act. These 4 disabilities are autism, cerebral palsy, what is still called mental retardation, and multiple disabilities. So these are 4 disabilities. And there are provisions, again, for plenary guardianship under the National Trust Act, which appear to be untouched by this bill. Now, this creates 2 very, very big problems. One is the fact that even the way the National Trust has been functioning, there's been a 2009, the National Trust has been in place since 1999, and in 2009 there was a study conducted. It was by the government of India on the way the local level committees, which are the bodies which are entrusted on dealing with guardianship, are functioning, and there have been lots of red flags raised about the fact that people. I mean, even the community doesn't believe in the local level committee. The local level committees are not functioning. And more importantly, it's kind of like, you have a system of guardianship and then there is no accountability after that. And it's kind of been left to individual local level committees to try and do some sort of monitoring. The problem is with the UNCRPD is that we've moved entirely away from the discourse of guardianship. What the UNCRPD talks about is supported decision making. And instead of a very, paternalistic view that you can't make decisions, we will make decisions on your, our guardian will make decisions on your behalf. What it's looking at is it's recognizing the fact that persons with disabilities can express will and preferences. Even if there is a difference in your mental capacity, there's still the ability to express a will and preference. And that will and preference needs to necessarily be considered when you're looking at how decision making is supposed to happen. So you will have persons who have capacity, and again, the decision as to whether you have capacity or not doesn't necessarily mean just because you can't communicate doesn't mean that you don't have capacity. The mental capacity tests which have been evolved are very, very quite strict in other jurisdictions. And it's in a very few number of cases. I mean, statistics are that persons with disabilities who can be said to lack mental capacity to make decisions are a minority. Yet we have guardianship provisions, for the mentally ill, which is presently under the Mental Health Act, and we have guardianship provisions which are under the National Trust Act, which are blanket provisions, and the existence of these provisions have been used by bodies like the Reserve Bank of India to say that, well, if you have cerebral palsy, we're not going to allow you to open a bank account unless you have a certificate of guardianship. And this is an issue which the National Trust was dealing with in recent times. So the fact is that we don't have a categorical statement that all persons need to have that people have legal capacity. You need to respect that, and that differing mental capacity needs to be accommodated, whether it's through supported decision making or whether it's through respecting the will and preferences of the person. That's something which needs to be considered. So this is something which is completely absent from the bill, and it is a huge sore point among persons with disabilities who fall under the category of persons who have disputes regarding legal and mental capacity. Thank you.
Now, the one important point that I take away from what you're saying, Amba, is that, and again, this is, I'm trying to look at it from a very, very simple social point of view while I'm looking at the politics behind this, is that ultimately, are we saying that the government is not alive to the possibility of those who have disabilities actually being in a position in which they can take decisions on their own? And maybe that's an area which has not been addressed in this bill. Is that what you're suggesting, Amba?
Yes, I think that what happens or what we've seen from the field is that you will have instances of persons with disabilities who could make their own decisions if they're given information in a format which they can understand. The problem really is that we have no guidance. There are no guidelines, or on how, like for instance, pretty much what Apoorva was saying, that it's way too wide to decide that if you have a mental illness, we might we probably need to make sure that you don't make any decisions with regard to your finances and property. And I think what needs to be enabled there, and what isn't stressed enough, is two situations. One is that how do you ensure that people with disabilities are given the support that they require to make independent decisions. This could be as simple as saying that I need a sign language interpretation if I'm deaf, of what I'm being asked to do, or something as or maybe a pictorial representation, or the assistance of of someone to help me do that. And on the other hand, if you're saying that, okay, if this is despite all best efforts, it's not possible, what are the tests that you are implementing in that case? Like, how do you ensure that you're still having a legal regime where the person's will and preferences are being looked at, or are being considered? And this is something which which has evolved. Like I said, again, because of the European Commission on Human Rights, you have something which has been evolved in India. And the argument which keeps getting thrown back to us, of course, is that India is a different country, and you can't look at what's happening in the West and expect this to happen in India. But at the same time, people with disabilities have rights. And if India has ratified the UNCRPD without reservations, then you need to find a way in which these rights are given a voice. You can't, say that, yeah, we signed the UNCRPD, but there's no way that we can do this. And so I'm sorry, but some disabilities will get what they require and other disabilities will not. That becomes difficult to swallow, in my opinion. As somebody who works cross disability, I think it's very difficult for me to reconcile that.
No, fair point. And Nipun, the other thought which has come into my mind, and again, just taking off from what Amba was saying, isn't it true ultimately that even if you have to look at it from a very social point of view, isn't it true that the feeling is that if a person is disabled or if a person is differently abled, then that person is not in a position in which that individual can take what is quote unquote the correct kind of decisions? Is that a feeling that you get, and you believe is that an area which is of concern to you?
Yes, so because even when I go to a restaurant, there are many times when I'm not even offered a menu because people, even waiter thinks that because I'm physically disabled, I do not have the power to make my own decision to even choose what I want to eat. Till class 10th, people, even my own classmates, used to think that I'm mentally challenged because I was physically challenged. I did not have a single friend till I was in class 10th. In class 10th, I scored 87% and I proved my class wrong in a way. And there are many people who became my friends later on who actually went on to later on tell me when they became close friends, that we were a bit scared to approach you because we didn't know how you'll respond, etc. So people with physical disabilities are not looked at as complete individuals in life. What I would like to say is that we are also, complete human beings. We have interests, we have hobbies, we love people, we hate people, we have ambitions. So, and I think that's what people do not understand, that people with physical disabilities are also complete individuals.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you. That often it's almost as if that those who are disabled or differently abled are looked at as people from a different planet altogether. And I see this happening all around me, and I sometimes wonder whether what you require is just legislation. You just require interference at the level of government, or what are the Nipun, let's put it this way: that what do you think could be done by society as a whole? The law of the land is there. It's a law which is on, and it will continue to evolve. But what do you think should social organizations, whether it's grassroots or any other place, what's the kind of role you feel that these organizations can play?
I'll really talk about society as a whole. I think attitudes in society as a whole need to change, starting from the private sector, where employment of people with disabilities is a big challenge today. In fact, my own foundation started an Equal Opportunity Award next year, where we recognize this hotel chain called Lemon Tree Hotels that has a vision that 25% of their employees should be people with disabilities. Organizations need to realize that people with disabilities can contribute economically to this country too. And I think once that happens, people with disabilities will start earning a livelihood. And when you start earning a livelihood, you have more respect in your own family too. There's another very interesting venture that's in Mumbai called medical couriers, where deaf and mute people are hired to deliver courier services in Bombay. So I
Yeah.
think the private sector needs to tie up, not tie up, but the private sector also needs to equally contribute towards making sure people with disabilities become a part of society. I think the change needs to happen at the school level itself. Through my foundation, I've launched a small comic called Pepper Makes a Special Friend. What this comic is about is it's a cartoon comic where there's this character on a wheelchair who interacts with 5, 6 year old children with disabilities, and basically, and I've tried launching it in various schools. I was at Shiv Nadar School, Gurgaon, 2 weeks back. I was trying to interact with children and it's basically at the school level itself, but in the curriculum, one needs to be taught about disabilities and how a person with a disability is just another normal human being. I think that's where one can start.
You think Apoorva is like like we have reservations for on the basis of caste, on the basis of communities. Do you believe maybe the time has come for also now for us to look seriously on the possibility of maybe reservations for the disabled, not just in the government sector? Because I know in the government sector there are some provisions. What about the private sector? Do you believe that's a possibility? Should discourse be moving to that level?
So the bill currently does actually try and move away from the act by providing for the fact that the government should endeavor to get the private sector as well to reserve 5% of their seats, whether in employment or in schools, etc. Of course, there's only an extent. The government cannot mandate the private sector to get reservations on a compulsory basis, but they have tried to do that within this bill. They have said that the government will endeavor that to the extent a private establishment can reserve seats for the disabled, they should do that. Of course, there was, even with the Act, the PWD Act, there was a Supreme Court judgment lately with even right now the bill is moving up the reservation and employment even in government bodies to 5%, but the existing Act still says 3%. But even that, there was a Supreme Court judgment where it said that the 3%, even that is not really being implemented, and it needs to, the government needs to ensure the 3% reservation in employment in government bodies or even in educational institutions, because this was the pre-Right to Education Act period where, education wasn't, even primary education wasn't compulsory. So it wasn't exactly happening the way it should have, even going by the Act, until the Supreme Court judgment. But the bill in that respect is trying to bring that in by saying that the government should encourage the private sector to have reservations for the disabled.
So it's more like an affirmative action kind of step that we're talking about, like when reservations for religious minorities is being talked about, it was moved forward on the basis of affirmative actions which should be taken by different bodies. But what about again? Let's look at it again from an international point of view. Say in Europe or in America, in any of are there reservations for differently able or disabled people in the private sector?
No. It's what the principle actually that's being and this is what the UNCRPD talks about as well. Reservations are contentious because the UNCRPD does not speak about reservations as such, but what it does, it introduces a concept of reasonable accommodation, which means that persons with disabilities should be given all reasonable accommodation to perform the acts that, or to perform the work, etc., or participate in education that they require. Because one of the conflicts that is also happening in this bill is that when you look at government reservations, there is a clear there are clear provisions which say that you can identify jobs for persons with disabilities. And within that, you can have reservations. Now, this is something which the Supreme Court actually came down on. It was something very similar in '95. And there was a Supreme Court judgment in 2013 which actually said that you cannot have this identification of jobs. Even so, that seems to have been, it finds a place in the present bill as well. So one of the things that what is troublesome is that if you have certain jobs reserved for people with disabilities, it's the kind of jobs that one or that that I would say able-bodied people think that people with disabilities can do. Whereas what it should be looking at is saying that we are going to have jobs open and you can apply for a job. And if you need a certain reasonable accommodation to perform this particular job, we can give that to you. Whether it's, say, for a blind person, it might just be adequate software on their computer to perform this task, or it may be the assistance of, of some other device, or say an interpreter, or as the case may be. But if you're otherwise qualified, you should not be disqualified because you require a little extra to be able to do this particular job. And that's something which needs to be addressed, because one of the, because there was a right to information application filed by in New Delhi by Dr. Satyendra Singh. And in that, it was revealed that because since 95 there's been a 3% reservation. Since 95 till I think 2013, which is when the RTI was filed, just 0.21% of those vacancies have been filled out of reserved seats, of reserved posts. Why has that happened? I mean, is it that there aren't enough? Of course there are enough, and this is, mind you, at that point of time there were just 1% for the blind and visually impaired, 1% for I think hearing impaired, and 1% for locomotor disabilities. But why is it? Anecdotally, I've spoken to many people who've said that when they've looked for government jobs, they had MAs, but they were being asked to be lift operators or answer phones, which is something that they didn't want to do. They thought they, rightly so, that they were overqualified for things like this. But this is what tends to happen when you have identification of jobs, and that's a huge problem in the present bill. Sorry, just one point. Earlier there was a question on allocation of resources. Equals, which is an organization in Chennai, based out of Chennai, which is actually looking very extensively at the way budgetary allocations happen for disabilities, estimated that 0.2% of overall allocation in the state of Tamil Nadu was for persons with disabilities. So that's one indication, state-wise at least, and Tamil Nadu is supposed to actually be doing a better job with the rights of persons with disabilities. So you can get an idea.
I would be wrong to suggest that maybe the maximum that a particular state could have done in terms of budgetary allocation would be 0.2%. As you're saying that that Tamil Nadu happens to be a state which may have taken the lead. So I just wonder whether this is really a matter of concern for the government, and that's the point that I was looking at. Because frankly, if you ask me, I sometimes just get the sense the more I speak to ministers and people in the corridors of power in Delhi in particular, I just don't get the sense that governments over the years have been serious when it has come to dealing with people with disabilities. But lots of questions also coming in now via Twitter, and let me just take some of our viewers' questions also. So this question is coming. Maybe Apoorva, you could take us through this. Is India contributing enough for research efforts for disability to those who are disabled?
Right. So currently, the officers that are responsible for dealing with disability and the bodies, there's mainly a chief commissioner of disability, and there are commissioners of state for disabilities. These are the bodies that basically try and review safeguards, etc., for disabled people. But there is a body called the Central Coordination Committee and a state coordination committee in each state. They basically try and review the policy of the government with respect to disabled people, conduct research, and things like that. So that's been the basic framework in terms of how the government conducts research and tries to keep their infrastructure and technology upgraded to be accessible to the disabled. The Rights of Persons with Disability Bill is largely keeping the same framework, giving it different names. So now we're about to have a central advisory body and a state advisory body that will advise the government on and will do the research map that should be in place for the disabled people to achieve their full potential and things like that. So that's basically how it works.
Nipun, just to go back to the question of reservation that I was raising with Amba and Apoorva, you believe, Nipun, that could that be something that one could look at closely, reservations for disabled people in the private sector?
That can be studied, but you also asked why the government doesn't take people with disabilities seriously. I think sociologically, people with disabilities are the only minority anywhere. Disability is not hereditary, unlike any other minority, and thus, according to the first past the vote system, people with disabilities are too dispersed, and that's why they've never become a real serious vote bank. And I really think that's the reason why people with disabilities have been neglected compared to other minorities in India. So reservations could be an interesting way, but I really don't see them coming because people with disabilities are not a vote bank in terms of conventional Indian politics, but certainly something that can be studied.
Yeah, because I wonder that the best scenario for any society to be judged would be how do we look at those who are who are differently abled or who are disabled. I mean, I would say that if whether it's grassroots or any other organization which does some work in this field, I think that it's something which could really go a long way in putting in sending the right kind of message, the right kind of vibes about our country as a whole. So let me just get final comments from all of you, starting first with you, Amba. Then, what do you believe, Amba, should be that one key step which you think the government should take as we move ahead? Now we have a new government in place. We have a prime minister who keeps striking the right kind of noises globally. What is it one step you believe that maybe the prime minister himself, should take to ensure that there can be justice which can be given, equality which can be created for those global women?
I think that if we're looking at this bill, which is kind of, I'm just going to focus on the bill right now, and we've given Inclusive Planet and through the Disability Rights Alliance, we've given extensive comments on the bill and formulations, and that's available on our website. So I'm not going to go into that right now, but what I think needs to be done is that it needs to be acknowledged that when you look at, if you have a society which is more accessible for people with disabilities, that it contributes overall to making society more efficient. When we look at it from the perspective of disability, you might have a particular mindset towards it, but let's look at Indian society being aging. We are going to have, as the years go by, we're going to have a much larger population that is old and requires support. We have children. We have lots and lots of children. All of provisions when we talk about making things more accessible, whether it's having things available in a simple language, or saying that we want bigger signboards, or having ramps instead of staircases. All of this contributes to more people being able to contribute to society, and overall societies become more effective. So I think that when we look at it saying that, or when people argue that, oh, there are only that many % of people with disabilities, it's not like provisions which are meant for persons with disabilities are only limited to them. Everyone uses it. If there's a ramp, if there's a lift in a building, everyone uses it regardless of whether they have a disability or not. So I think that what needs to be done really is that when we're looking at this bill as your implementation of the UNCRPD, while there are issues of society which Nipun raised, which exist, you still need to have a legal framework in which you can achieve the best possible standard of living for people with disabilities, including removing of discrimination and enabling their participation. Therefore, I think it's extremely, extremely important that the government looks at this bill very, very seriously. And I request the standing committee look carefully at all of the suggestions which are being made. I'm aware of countless submissions which have been made to really look at what exactly. This is a legislation which began with civil society consultations in 2011. And what finally got passed by a cabinet was something which was very different. Please go into that and see where exactly these discrepancies exist. That's what my request is.
Okay. What about you, Apoorva?
There are obviously a few issues with the bill. It's interesting to note that this is a UPA 2 bill. It was introduced in Parliament in February, and it was then referred to the standing committee, which was due to submit its report within 3 months, which hasn't happened yet. But they have recently asked for comments, and they're in the process of preparing their report. But of course, that was right. It was introduced right before the elections. A new government has come into place after that. It remains to be seen whether the government will decide to go ahead with this bill, or whether they'll introduce significant amendments to it, or will they withdraw it and bring in a new bill entirely altogether. But of course, apart from the issues that I've already highlighted with respect to how the bill has been drafted, there's another provision that's a general provision, which basically says that anything committed under with the bill, with the new bill, anything which is everything that is under the bill can be treated as an offense. Whoever does anything to contravene the provisions of this bill can be liable with fine and certain amount of imprisonment. But a lot of the bill is, about rights and entitlements, as we discussed. And, there is, for example, a certain provision like every disabled person will have the right to live in a community. But putting that provision together with this one, it could be said, for example, let's take if there is an autistic child which is, say, being homeschooled because the parents think that's what's best for the child. After that, is it possible that the parents can be held criminally liable because you're taking the child away from community living in a way? So there are things like that which could have been more thought through. And within the same provision, it also says that the government can further notify rules and regulations which the contravention of which could also be criminal. A person could be criminally liable for and could be penalized. It can also be argued that the bill should any law, any bill should clearly identify the things for which a person can be criminally liable. Any offenses, any penalty should be clearly highlighted, and it shouldn't be left to delegated legislation. So that's one other major issue with the bill. But yeah, that's my final comment.
And Nipun, you've already brought us up to date with what you believe are some of the key concerns which the government should be addressing. But I'm just looking at the common thread. The common thread appears to be that there are, even in this new bill which we're talking about, there are lots of areas which the government could have delved into in a much deeper way, in a much sharper way. And maybe the government hasn't done that. Is there, I don't know if you've gone through the provisions of the bill, but do you believe that there is something, one strategic point you believe that the government should perhaps put a little more on?
I think apart from the bill, the government should also have a talisman to all ministries that you need to look after these particular interests and have a particular list of things, because disabled people live in a in a society. That's why I don't think one bill will, however good the bill is, the bill will not be enough. All ministries need to take care of people with disabilities and make them and look after that particular stakeholder while creating any particular law in this country.
Okay, on that note, thanks Nipun, thanks Amba, and thanks Apoorva for joining us on this special program. Very
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope that anyone who watches this, and I'm sure that this will be out on YouTube soon, anyone who watches this, please, there are some very concrete suggestions that let's see whether the government will really act on these suggestions. Thanks, guys. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this hangout. It was really informative, and like I mentioned, because we couldn't have a political representative in real time, this hangout will be going to the Standing Committee on Social Justice and Empowerment and the Disability Affairs Department in the Ministry. Thank you all for joining. I will post the YouTube link shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.